Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a massive stack of research. We've got diplomatic cables, military analyses, historical retrospectives, and we are focusing on a conflict that occupies a really strange, almost ghostly space in our history books.
It really does.
It's the event that sits right between, the moral clarity of World War II and then the televised chaos of Vietnam.
It's the conflict everyone knows by name, but very few people, I think, really understand in terms of its mechanics. We are, of course, talking about the Korean War.
Right, and you so often hear it called the Forgotten War, which, to be honest, has always felt like a bit of a lazy label to me. I mean, how do you forget a war where millions of people died and which technically hasn't even ended yet?
It is a massive paradox, isn't it? It's called forgotten because I think for the American public at the time, it was a grim, confusing slog they just wanted to move past.
Yeah, they just had World War II.
They just had the biggest war in human history. They wanted the economic boom of the 50s, new cars and suburbs, not body bags coming back from a place they probably couldn't find on a map.
But the sources we have today, and we're looking specifically at the work of historians like Warren Cohen, they argue this war isn't some footnote, it is the main event.
It is the event. The phrase that jumped out at me from the reading, and I think it's the one we have to anchor to, is that the Korean War was the event that globalized and militarized the Cold War.
Okay, let's unpack that. Globalized and militarized. What does that actually mean?
Well, before Korea, the Cold War was, let's call it a political staring contest. It was economic aid, like the Marshall Plan. It was speeches, spies in trench coats in Berlin. It was a competition of ideas.
Right. Capitalism versus communism, but fought with words and money, mostly.
Exactly. But Korea's where the Cold War turns hot. It's where it stops being a metaphor and starts being about real soldiers and real tanks. It's where the world that we all lived in for the next 40 years, the nuclear standoffs, the proxy wars, the massive defense budgets, that world was actually built on the Korean Peninsula.
So our mission today is to go deep. We aren't just skimming the dates and the battles. We really want to understand how a local issue, a civil war on a peninsula in East Asia, somehow spiraled out of control and threatened to start World War III.
And to do that, you have to set the scene. We have to transport ourselves back to the wreckage of 1945.
The post-World War II landscape.
Right. Guns have just gone silent in Europe and the Pacific. Hitler is dead. Japan has surrendered. And you have the Grand Alliance, the U.S., the U.K., and the Soviet Union. They're all high-fiving over the victory. But the sources show that the hangover, it set in almost immediately.
Because the common enemy that united them was gone.
Precisely. The glue that held them together just dissolved. You have the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945, which were supposed to be about, rebuilding the world in this new spirit of cooperation.
But they turned into land grabs.
Pretty much. Stalin is deeply paranoid. He feels the West is trying to encircle him. The U.S., on the other hand, is watching Stalin topple governments in Eastern Europe using what they called salami tactics.
Salami tactics.
Yeah, just slicing off the opposition piece by piece, one non-communist party at a time, until he's in total control of places like Poland, Hungary.
And this paranoia and mistrust, it just builds and builds, leading to Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech in 46, and then the Truman Doctrine in 47. This is the birth of containment.
Containment is the key word. It becomes the entire basis of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. decides its job is to draw a line in the sand and say to the Soviets, communism goes no further.
But, and this is so critical for you to understand, up until 1950, all the eyes, all the attention, it was on Europe.
Oh, completely. The Berlin blockade, the Marshall Plan, the crises in Greece and Turkey, the State Department, the Pentagon, they were obsessed with Germany. That's where they thought the next war would start.
So Asia was, what, a sideshow?
It was secondary. It was considered a backwater compared to the industrial heartland of Europe. But then, almost overnight, the spotlight violently swings to Korea. And to understand why, we have to look at Section 1 of our outline, A House Divided.
Because Korea wasn't always two countries, right?
No, not at all. It was an ancient, unified kingdom with its own language, its own culture. But Japan had annexed it in 1910 and ruled it with an iron fist for decades.
Brutal occupation.
So when Japan collapses in August 1945, there's a total power vacuum. The Japanese overlords are surrendering, but who do they surrender to?
And this brings us to one of the most absurd and truly consequential moments in the entire 20th century, the division. You might imagine this was decided by some high-level summit with maps and experts and weeks of negotiation.
But the sources tell a story that sounds more like two guys in a dorm room pulling an all-nighter. It really, really does. It's August 10th, 1945. The Japanese are about to surrender. Soviet troops are already marching into the northern part of Korea from Manchuria. The nearest U.S. troops are 600 miles away at Okinawa.
So Washington panics.
They panic. They realize if they don't do something, the Soviets are just going to take the whole peninsula by default.
Mm-hmm.
They need a line, a
Yeah.
place to say, you stop here, we stop here.
So the job falls to these two young colonels in the Pentagon.
Dean Rusk, who would later be Secretary of State during Vietnam, ironically,
Oof.
and another officer named Charles Bonesteel. It is late at night. It's hot and humid in Washington. They're completely exhausted,
Mhm.
and they are told, find a line now.
When they don't even have a proper military map of Korea.
No. Can you believe that? The Pentagon didn't have a good map. They had to scrounge one up from a copy of National Geographic. They literally pulled it off a wall or out of a pile.
That's incredible.
So they're looking at this magazine map, trying to find a natural barrier, maybe a river north of Seoul. But the map is too small. The scale is all wrong. They can't see the terrain clearly. So Bonesteel just points his finger and says, what about the 38th parallel?
Just a latitude line,
Yeah.
no geographical significance at all.
None. It's just a straight line cutting across rivers, mountains, towns, farms. It made no sense on the ground. But it did two things. It divided the country roughly in half, and crucially, it kept the capital, Seoul, in the American zone.
So they propose this thinking Stalin will just laugh at them.
They fully expected him to reject it and just keep marching south. But to their absolute shock, Stalin said yes.
Why? Why would he agree to that?
Well, at that moment, Stalin was playing a bigger game. He was consolidating his gains in Eastern Europe. He was more interested in getting a secure buffer zone in North Korea and a warm water port than he was in starting a fight with the Americans over the whole peninsula. He accepted the 38th parallel.
And just like that, a line drawn by two tired guys on a magazine map becomes the defining scar of the Cold War in Asia. A scar that's still there today. So the Japanese troops north of that line surrendered to the Soviets, and those south of the line surrendered to the Americans. And it was all supposed to be temporary, just an administrative convenience.
Temporary, the most dangerous word in politics.
It really is, because immediately, the two zones started to become two different worlds. In the north, the Soviets didn't just occupy, they cloned their system. They started looking for a local leader who would be loyal to Moscow.
And they found their man in Kim Il-sung. Now, the common perception, I think, is that Kim was just a Soviet puppet, a stooge they put in power.
The sources correct that view pretty significantly. Kim Il-sung was a true believer, but he was also his own man. He was young, only in his early 30s, but he had a legitimate revolutionary backstory. He'd spent years fighting as a guerrilla against the Japanese in Manchuria.
So he had credibility. He had credibility, yeah. He was a fervent communist, no doubt, but he was also a fervent Korean nationalist. He wanted to build a strong, unified socialist state under his rule. He wasn't just following orders from Moscow. He was building a cult of personality around himself from day one.
Okay, so that's the north. Meanwhile, in the south, the U.S. is looking for their guy.
And they settle on Syngman Rhee. Now, Rhee is a fascinating, complicated character. He's much older than Kim, in his 70s by this point. He had lived in the U.S. for decades, actually got a Ph.D. from Princeton.
So you'd think he'd be the perfect pro-American Democrat.
You would think.
Yeah.
But the sources describe him as a difficult man to work with, which is a massive understatement.
How so?
Rhee was a hardcore authoritarian nationalist. He hated the communists with an absolute passion, but he also deeply resented American meddling. He wanted to rule Korea his way, which often meant brutally suppressing any and all opposition. He wasn't a puppet either. He was a stubborn, often infuriating leader who spent as much time arguing with the U.S. Embassy as he did fighting the North.
So you have these two guys, Kim and Rhee, staring daggers at each other across the 38th parallel. And both of them are claiming to be the only legitimate leader of all Korea.
Right. And there was this brief, completely doomed attempt at a trusteeship where the U.S. and USSR were supposed to hold Korea's hand and guide it towards a unified election.
But the trust had just evaporated by then.
Completely. The Soviets wouldn't let UN observers into the North. The U.S. wouldn't let the communists participate freely in the South. So in 1938, the split becomes official and permanent. You get the Republic of Korea, the ROK in the South, with Rhee as president, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK in the North, with Kim as premier.
Two hostile states locked in a cage together, and then in a move that seems insane in hindsight, the referees leave the building.
This is the part that really sets the stage for the war. By the middle of 1949, both the Soviet Union and the United States have withdrawn their main military forces.
Okay, I want to pause on that. Because if the tension was so high, If these two leaders were constantly threatening to invade each other, why on earth would the U.S. pack up and leave? It seems like gross negligence.
It's the aha moment when you look at U.S. strategy at the time.
Mm.
You have to understand the internal debate happening in Washington. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military planners, they looked at the map. They saw Korea as a mainland appendage, a peninsula,
A potential trap.
a huge trap. They thought, if we get into a land war there, we are outnumbered by the masses of China and Russia. They much preferred an island defense strategy defending Japan, the Philippines, Okinawa.
The famous Asian defense perimeter.
Exactly. They explicitly decided in their planning documents that Korea was not a vital strategic interest to the United States.
Mm.
They didn't want to get sucked into what they called costly entanglements on the continent.
So the military wanted out. What about the politicians?
The politicians at the State Department were worried. They thought pulling out would damage American prestige. But ultimately, the military argument won. They left Rhee with a lightly armed police force and said, good luck.
Meanwhile, the Soviets also withdraw, but they don't leave Kim Il-sung empty-handed.
Oh, not at all. They leave a parting gift, a massive one. They left behind a modern military infrastructure. They trained the North Korean army. They left them tanks, the famous T-34s, heavy artillery, aircraft. They even left them stockpiles of captured Japanese weapons.
So by early 1950, the balance of power is just completely lopsided.
It's a coiled spring versus, well, not much. The North is heavily armed, well-trained, and led by a man desperate to attack. The South is chaotic, politically unstable, and lightly armed. The imbalance was glaring to anyone who was paying attention.
Which brings us directly to Section 2, greenlighting the invasion. Because the narrative I grew up with, and I think most people in the West did, was that this was Stalin's war, that he pushed a button in Moscow and ordered his North Korean minions to attack.
And that is exactly what the Truman administration believed in June 1950. They saw it as a clear case of Soviet expansionism. But the Soviet archives, which opened up after the Cold War in the 90s, they tell a completely different, much more nuanced story.
This wasn't Stalin's idea.
Not at all. It was Kim Il-sung's. He was the prime mover, the instigator,
Chomping at the bit.
relentlessly. The sources show he spent a full year, from mid-1949 to mid-1950, lobbying Stalin. He sent 48 separate telegrams to Moscow. He traveled there in person. He was practically begging, let me invade. The South is weak. The government is unpopular. Their people will rise up and welcome us as liberators. We can finish the whole thing in 3 days.
Stroke the Southerners in the teeth. That was his quote, wasn't it?
That's one. He was absolutely obsessed with unification by force. But for a very long time, Stalin kept saying, no, yet.
Why? Stalin wasn't exactly known for his peaceful restraint.
No, but he was known for his cunning and his survival instinct. Stalin was terrified, and I think legitimately terrified, of starting World War III with the United States. He knew the U.S. had the atomic bomb and the Soviets didn't yet. He knew the Soviet Union was still rebuilding from the devastation of World War II. He told Kim flat out, no. If you attack, the Americans will intervene, and we will have a global war we can't win.
So what changed his mind? Why did the light finally turn green in early 1950?
The whole communist calculus, as the sources call it, shifted because of two massive geopolitical events in late 1949.
Okay, what were they?
First, in August 49, the Soviets successfully tested their own atomic bomb. The U.S. monopoly was broken. That gave Stalin a little more strategic confidence, a little more swagger.
Right. Mutually assured destruction begins to enter the equation.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And second, and maybe even more importantly, in October 49, the communists won the civil war in China. Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. Suddenly, from Stalin's perspective, the East looked like a juggernaut. The momentum was on their side.
And he also looked at the American withdrawal from Korea and thought,
They don't care. He
Yeah.
took it as a clear signal. He viewed an invasion now as a low-risk operation. He thought, Kim is probably right. He can rush in, take the South, and present the world with a fait accompli before the slow-moving bureaucratic Americans can even decide what to do about it.
but he still had a condition. He didn't just give Kim a blank check.
No, and this is classic Stalin, always hedging his bets. He told Kim, I will give you weapons, I will give you advisors, but I am not fighting for you. He made it crystal clear. If you get into trouble with the Americans, don't come crying to Moscow. Soviet troops will not fight.
So what was the condition?
The condition was that Kim had to get Mao Zedong's approval. He basically said, If China backs you, if they're willing to be your safety net, then I'll support it materially.
He's hedging. He's passing the risk on to China.
It's quintessential risk avoidance. He wants the geopolitical win of a unified communist Korea, but he doesn't want to risk any Russian blood for it.
So Kim goes to Beijing, and Mao consents. Why did Mao agree? China was an absolute wreck after decades of war.
For a few reasons. One, Mao was a true revolutionary. He believed in the global struggle against American imperialism. Two, he also believed the U.S. wouldn't intervene. And three, you have to give Kim credit, he played them against each other beautifully. He went to Mao and implied that Stalin was super enthusiastic, and then he went back to Stalin and said Mao was completely on board. A little bit of diplomatic triangulation.
Which leads us to the final fatal piece of the puzzle, what the sources call the Comedy of Errors, the speech by Dean Acheson.
Ah, yes. January 12, 1950, the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., Secretary of State Dean Acheson gives a major speech outlining U.S. defense policy in Asia.
And he draws a line on the mat.
He draws a very specific line.
Yeah.
He lists the Aleutian Islands, Japan, the Ryukyu Islands like Okinawa, and the Philippines as being inside the American defensive perimeter.
And he leaves a gaping hole where South Korea and Taiwan should be.
He explicitly leaves them out. He basically says that for areas outside this perimeter, no person can guarantee these areas against military attack.
I have to pause on this because in hindsight, it looks like absolute madness. Was he trying to invite an invasion? What was he thinking?
No, I don't think he's inviting it. The sources suggest he was trying to be legally precise. The U.S. didn't have a formal defense treaty with South Korea at that point. He was just stating a fact. But in diplomacy, what you mean to say matters so much less than what your enemy hears.
And what Stalin and Kim and Mao heard was, come on in, the water's fine.
It was a massive confirmation bias trap. They already wanted to believe the U.S. wouldn't fight. Acheson just handed them the official-looking evidence they were looking for. For them, it was the final green light.
So the stage is set, the plan is approved, the weapons are in place, and it's June 25, 1950. 4:00 a.m., it's raining. Section 3, the invasion and the seesaw war.
The North Korean People's Army, the KPA, surges across the 38th parallel. And you have to understand the mismatch here. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a blitzkrieg. It was a slaughter.
And the key weapon was the Soviet T-34 tank. Talk to me about the T-34. Why was that specific piece of hardware such a nightmare for the South?
The T-34 was, simply put, one of the greatest tanks ever built. It was the tank that really beat Hitler on the Eastern Front. It had thick, sloped armor, which meant that many anti-tank shells would just ricochet right off it. It had wide tracks so it could move easily through mud and rough terrain.
And the South Koreans had what to counter this?
Nothing. They had no tanks. They had some light American anti-tank weapons, bazookas that were basically useless. Their shells literally bounced off the T-34s.
So you can just imagine being a South Korean soldier. You fire your best weapon at this metal monster, you watch the shell bounce off, and it just keeps coming.
You break. The army just disintegrated. Seoul, the capital city, fell in 3 days. 3 days. Imagine the shockwaves that sent through Washington.
And the initial U.S. response.
It was chaotic. A scramble. Truman orders the closest troops, who were on occupation duty in Japan, to rush to Korea. But you have to understand, these were not combat-ready soldiers. They were, frankly, out of shape. They were poorly trained for this kind of war. They had old, leftover World War II equipment.
This is where we get the story of Task Force Smith.
A tragic story. It was a small, understrength battalion of about 500 Americans, sent as a speed bump to try and block the North Korean advance near a town called Ulsan.
How did that go for them?
It was a disaster, a complete rout. They had bazookas with old ammunition that failed to penetrate the T-34s. They were overrun in a matter of hours. It was a brutal, humiliating wake-up call. The U.S. Army was not the unstoppable juggernaut of 1945 anymore.
So the U.S. and the remaining ROK forces are just in a full-blown retreat, mile after bloody mile, down the peninsula.
All the way. They were pushed all the way to the southeast corner of the country into a tiny pocket that becomes known as the Pusan Perimeter. It's a box about 50 miles by 50 miles. Their backs are literally to the ocean.
It was a stand or die moment.
Literally. The commanding general, Walton Walker, told his officers, "There will be no more retreating. We are not going to be driven into the sea. We're going to die here if we have to."
Now, while this is happening on the ground, the political machinery in Washington is spinning up. Truman reacts almost instantly.
He does. And this is what really surprised Stalin. Truman didn't look at Korea and see a small Asian civil war. He looked at Korea and he saw Munich, 1938. He saw the failure of the world to stand up to Hitler. He believed that this was a test from Moscow. And if he let this aggression stand, The Soviets would be emboldened to do the same thing elsewhere, maybe in Germany.
So he takes the issue to the United Nations.
And here's where history delivers one of its greatest strokes of luck for the West. The U.S. proposes a Security Council resolution to condemn the invasion and send a UN force to save South Korea. Now, normally the Soviet Union has a veto power. They could have killed the resolution instantly with a single "niet."
But the Soviet chair was empty.
The chair was empty. The Soviet ambassador, a man named Jacob Malik, was boycotting the Security Council meetings at the time.
Why?
He was protesting the UN's refusal to give the China seat to Mao's new communist government. The seat was still held by the defeated nationalists who had fled to Taiwan. So because the Soviets were throwing a political tantrum outside the room, the vote happened inside the room without them. They missed their chance to use the veto.
Talk about a massive own goal.
A strategic blunder of epic proportions. So the UN command is formed. You have flags from 16 nations joining the effort. But let's be real, it was 90% American firepower, American troops, and American command.
So now we have the UN forces, mostly Americans, holding on by their fingernails in Busan. The North Koreans are hammering them relentlessly. It looks hopeless. And then General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander, enters the chat with a plan that everyone around him says is suicidal.
The Incheon landing, codenamed Operation Chromite. MacArthur wants to take the U.S. Marines and launch a massive amphibious assault at Incheon, which is way up the west coast, right next to Seoul, deep behind enemy lines.
Why was that considered so crazy, so risky?
Because Incheon is a logistical nightmare for an amphibious landing. The tides there are some of the most extreme in the world. They rise and fall by over 30 feet. When the tide goes out, it leaves miles and miles of deep, sticky mudflats.
So your landing craft would get stuck.
They'd be sitting ducks in the mud for hours waiting for the tide to come back in. On top of that, there was a narrow channel and a high seawall. The Navy and Marine planners told MacArthur the chances of success are 5,000 to 1 against.
And what was MacArthur's response?
He was the American Caesar. He was imperious. He basically said, the very impossibility of the operation is what will guarantee its surprise. The enemy will never expect us to be so foolish.
He bet everything on it.
And he was right.
He was spectacularly right. September 15th, 1950, the Marines storm the seawalls at high tide. It catches the North Koreans completely, totally off guard. They had left Incheon lightly defended.
And what was the strategic effect? It was like a knife cut. They severed the main supply lines of the North Korean army, which was still hammering away at Busan, hundreds of miles to the south. Suddenly, the KPA realizes the main enemy force is behind them. They panic, they break, and their army collapses.
It's a total reversal of fortune. Seoul is liberated within days. The North Koreans flee back across the 38th parallel. So, mission accomplished, right? Containment worked. The original border is restored.
And this.
Yeah.
This is the moment, the fatal shift, as one source calls it. This is where the whole story turns tragic, because they had won. They had achieved their original UN mandate. But the smell of total victory was intoxicating. Washington, the UN, and especially MacArthur, they decided that containment wasn't enough anymore.
They wanted rollback.
Exactly. The thinking became, why stop at the 38th parallel? The North Korean army is shattered. Why don't we cross the line, destroy their regime completely, and reunite the entire country under American protection?
That's pure hubris.
It's classic mission creep, fueled by overconfidence. They make the fateful decision to cross the parallel. And as the UN forces march north, they're marching straight toward a hidden tripwire that brings us to Section 4. The dragon enters.
China. Now, as the UN troops, mostly American GIs, get closer and closer to the Yalu River, which is the border between North Korea and China, Mao Zedong is watching. And he is getting extremely anxious.
He is. He used a very visceral metaphor to his commanders. He said, Korea is the lips and China is the teeth. If the lips are gone, the teeth will be cold.
Meaning, without North Korea as a buffer state, China itself is exposed to American invasion.
That's exactly how he saw it. And you have to remember, Mao is a paranoid revolutionary, too.
Yeah.
He sees the United States as this implacably hostile, counter-revolutionary imperialist power. And there was another specific trigger for him, the U.S. 7th Fleet.
Right. Truman had sent the Navy into the Taiwan Strait at the very beginning of the war.
To protect Taiwan, where the defeated nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek were. To Mao, that looked like the U.S. was reinserting itself into the Chinese Civil War. So he sees U.S. troops marching to his border in Korea, and he sees U.S. warships off his coast near Taiwan. From his perspective, he feels encircled.
So he decides he has to intervene, but Stalin is still playing his games in the background.
Oh, Stalin is playing 4D chess from the sidelines. He urges Mao to fight. He sends telegrams saying, you must save your socialist neighbor. Mao, quite reasonably, asks for Soviet air cover. because the Chinese army had no real air force. Stalin agrees, at first. But then, at the absolute last minute, Stalin gets cold feet.
He pulls the plug on the air support.
He backs out. He tells Mao, "We can provide some air support, but only over Chinese territory, not over the front lines in Korea." And crucially, he repeats, no Soviet ground troops. He actually told his inner circle that he was prepared to sacrifice North Korea altogether rather than risk a direct war with the U.S.
So he was willing to let Kim Il-sung be completely wiped off the map.
Yes, he would cut his losses. But Mao, feeling he had no other choice to protect his own revolution, decides to go in anyway, even without the Soviet air cover he was promised.
So, in late October and November of 1950, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army begins to cross the Yalu River.
And the stealth of this movement is just incredible. We're not talking about a small force. We're talking about 300,000 men.
How did they hide that many soldiers?
They moved only at night in massive columns. During the day, they were under strict orders to camouflage themselves and remain completely motionless in the mountains. If an American reconnaissance plane flew over, they had to freeze. If a soldier moved during daylight, he could be shot by his own officer for compromising the position of the entire army.
So the U.S. planes flew over and saw nothing.
Nothing. MacArthur was arrogantly telling President Truman at their Wake Island meeting, the Chinese will not intervene. The war will be over by Christmas.
Home by Christmas. Famous last words.
Absolutely. And then the trap springs. In late November, the Chinese attack with overwhelming numbers. They use human wave tactics, blowing bugles and whistles in the dead of night, swarming the isolated UN positions.
And the weather turns against the UN forces, too. We have to talk about the battle at the Chosin Reservoir.
The frozen Chosin. It was one of the coldest winters on record in Korea. The temperatures dropped to 30, even 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit.
I read that the morphine syrups, the Medic's plasma bottles, they froze solid.
They did. Plasma froze. Morphine had to be kept in the medics' mouths to keep it liquid. Guns jammed because the oil froze. Men's skin would stick to the cold metal of their rifles. And in these conditions, the U.S. 1st Marine Division was completely surrounded by nearly 10 divisions of Chinese troops in these brutal mountains. It was an epic fight for sheer survival.
But this is where we get that famous quote from the Marine Commander, General Oliver P. Smith. Retreat, hell. We're not retreating, we're just attacking in another direction.
It sounds like pure bravado, but it was actually accurate. They had to fight their way out of the trap, back towards the sea. It was a brutal fighting withdrawal. They made it, but the casualties were horrific. All across the front, the UN forces were sent into the longest retreat in U.S. military history.
Push all the way back down past the 38th parallel, past Seoul again.
Yes. Seoul changes hands for the 4th time in less than a year. The city is just utter rubble by this point, and the panic in Washington reaches a fever pitch. This is where the nuclear question comes up in a very real way.
Truman brings it up himself.
He does. At a press conference, a reporter asks him if the use of the atomic bomb is on the table, and Truman says that there has always been active consideration of its use.
He didn't say no.
He definitely did not say no. And the global freakout was instantaneous. The British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, literally got on a plane and flew to Washington to beg Truman not to do it.
Why were the British so scared?
Because they had a defense pact. The Europeans were terrified that if the U.S. nuked China, the Soviets, who now had the bomb too, would retaliate by nuking London or Paris. They saw this spiraling into World War III.
And what was Mao's reaction to the nuclear threat? Did he blink?
Not at all. He famously called the atomic bomb a paper tiger. He told his generals that the U.S. could kill 10 million, 20 million Chinese people, but China had hundreds of millions more. He claimed they could absorb the blow and just keep fighting. It was a terrifying, terrifying game of chicken.
So we enter 1951. The lines on the battlefield start to stabilize. The Chinese have the manpower. The U.S. has the superior firepower and air power. They end up in a bloody gridlock, basically right back where they started at the 38th parallel.
The war of movement is over, and the war of attrition begins. And this brings us to Section 5, stalemate and the general's downfall. Because General Douglas MacArthur is not a man who does stalemate.
No, he wants to win. He starts publicly and privately demanding permission to expand the war.
He wants it all. He wants to bomb Chinese cities in Manchuria. He wants a naval blockade of the Chinese coast. He wants to unleash Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces from Taiwan to invade mainland China. He even suggested, and this is truly chilling, spreading a belt of radioactive cobalt waste across the neck of the Korean peninsula to create a permanent lethal barrier.
He's advocating for total war.
Yes. But Truman and his advisors in Washington want limited war. Truman famously said that expanding the fight to China would be the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy.
Meaning the real enemy was the Soviet Union and China was just a distraction.
Exactly.
Mm.
Truman's strategic nightmare was that if the U.S. committed its entire military to a massive land war in China, Stalin would just see a wide-open door and march his armies into Western Europe and take it.
So the friction between the president and his general becomes unbearable. MacArthur starts writing letters to Congress, publicly criticizing the president's war policy.
It's blatant insubordination. He's challenging the civilian control of the military. So, in April 1951, Truman does the unthinkable and fires him. It was political suicide for Truman at the time. MacArthur came home to massive ticker tape parades. He was a hero, but it was a crucial moment for establishing who is ultimately in charge.
So MacArthur is out. The war is a stalemate, but it drags on for 2 more years. Why? If everyone knew neither side could win a decisive victory, why did they keep fighting and dying?
The peace talks at a village called Panmunjom were agonizingly slow. Negotiating with the communists was, as one diplomat put it, like chewing glass. They would sit in a room in silence for hours just to prove a point. But the big sticking point, the one issue that kept men dying on hills with names like Porkchop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge for 2 more years, was the issue of the prisoners of war, the POWs.
Explain that. Usually at the end of a war, you just swap all the prisoners.
That's the normal procedure, called mandatory repatriation. But the problem was that tens of thousands of North Korean and Chinese prisoners being held by the UN didn't want to go back. They had surrendered and, during screenings, said, "We hate communism, we want to stay in the South or go to Taiwan."
And that is a massive propaganda disaster for the communists.
A humiliation. It completely undermined their entire ideology that they were liberating the oppressed. So they demanded that the U.S. force these men to return, at gunpoint if necessary. The U.S., for its part, refused on humanitarian grounds. Truman famously said, "We will not buy an armistice by trafficking in human misery."
So the war continued and men died just over this point of ideological pride.
Essentially, yes. They fought these horrific, pointless battles for meaningless hills, not to gain territory, but just to show resolve at the negotiating table in Panmunjom. It was a brutal, cynical period of the war.
So what finally broke the deadlock in 1953?
It was a combination of biology and politics. First, in the U.S., Dwight D. Eisenhower is elected president. He's a respected five-star general. He has military credibility. And he quietly sends word to the Chinese through back channels that if the war doesn't end soon, he might reconsider the use of nuclear weapons. He plays the bad cop card.
And the biology part.
March 5th, 1953. Joseph Stalin suffers a massive stroke and dies.
The man who gave the green light in the first place is gone.
And you can almost hear the collective sigh of relief in the Kremlin. His successors, Khrushchev, Malenkov, they were in the middle of a power struggle. They didn't want this expensive, draining war in Asia anymore. They wanted to focus on domestic issues, on improving living standards. So they put immense pressure on the Chinese and North Koreans to finally take the deal and end the war.
So on July 27, 1953, the armistice is finally signed.
The guns go silent. A demilitarized zone, the DMZ, is created near the 38th parallel, a 2.5-mile-wide no-man's land. But, and this is so crucial for you to remember, it was an armistice, a ceasefire. It was not a peace treaty. Technically, the war never ended.
Which is why there are still U.S. troops in South Korea today. So let's zoom out. Section 6. The global legacy. Because if you just look at the map, the border in 1953 is almost exactly where it was in 1950. On the surface, it looks like a bloody, pointless draw. A waste.
A tactical draw? Yes. But a strategic earthquake. This war, more than almost any other event, built the world we live in now. Let's break it down by country to really see the impact.
Let's start with Korea itself.
Absolute, utter devastation. The United States dropped more bombs on North Korea than were dropped in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. Cities like Pyongyang were flattened, completely leveled. The sources estimate somewhere between 2 and 3 million civilians died north and south, and the division of the country became permanent, hardened in concrete and barbed wire. Millions of families were separated, most never to see each other again.
And the two Koreas went on completely different trajectories after that.
Night and day. South Korea, with massive U.S. and later Japanese investment, eventually, after some rocky decades of dictatorship, becomes a vibrant democracy and an economic powerhouse. North Korea becomes the Hermit Kingdom, a totalitarian garrison state built on the fear of another American invasion.
Okay, what about Japan? They weren't fighting, but one of the sources calls the war a gift of the gods for them. Why?
It saved Japan's economy. In 1950, Japan was still in ruins from World War II, its industry shattered. But suddenly, the U.S. needed a massive supply base right next to the war zone. They poured billions of dollars into Japanese factories to build trucks, sandbags, napalm, uniforms. It jump-started the Japanese economic miracle. Companies we know today, like Toyota and Mitsubishi, were basically saved by Korean War procurement contracts.
And politically for Japan.
The U.S. stopped treating Japan as a defeated enemy and started treating them as a vital ally against communism. The American occupation ended with the Treaty of San Francisco, and Japan became the cornerstone of U.S. strategy in the Pacific, an unsinkable aircraft carrier.
Now for the big one, the United States. How did this forgotten war change the U.S.?
Fundamentally, before Korea, the U.S. was demobilizing from World War II. There was a secret policy document circulating in Washington called NSC 68, a blueprint to triple the defense budget to fight the Cold War globally. But President Truman wouldn't sign it. He thought it was too radical, too expensive. The country wouldn't stand for it.
Then North Korea invades.
And the checkbook flies wide open. The defense budget triples, just as NSC 68 had proposed. The U.S. builds a massive, permanent standing army for the first time in its peacetime history. They build military bases all over the world. They create what Eisenhower would later warn against, the military-industrial complex. Korea convinced the American establishment that they had to be the world's policemen.
And it cemented the domino theory in their minds.
Absolutely. The belief that if you let one country fall to communism, its neighbors will fall one by one. This exact logic leads the U.S. directly into Vietnam a decade later. The thinking in the White House was, we drew a line and stopped them in Korea, we have to draw a line and stop them in Vietnam.
And what about Europe? We started by saying all the focus was on Europe. How did an Asian war affect Germany?
This is one of the most fascinating and ironic consequences. The leaders in Washington and London looked at the North Korean invasion and thought, my God, what if East Germany does this to West Germany? They panicked. So they did something that was unthinkable just 5 years after WWII. They decided to rearm West Germany. They put guns back in the hands of the Germans and invited them to join NATO.
That must have been Stalin's absolute worst nightmare.
It was everything he had fought World War II to prevent. And that leads it to the final piece, the Soviet legacy. Stalin thought Korea was a low-risk gamble to pick up a strategic piece of territory on the cheap. It turned out to be his single greatest strategic disaster of the Cold War.
How so?
Because it did the one thing he should have wanted to avoid at all costs. It united and militarized the West against him. It gave NATO, which had been a bit of a paper tiger, a real purpose and a real army. It led to the rearmament of his mortal enemy, Germany. It encircled the Soviet Union with a ring of hostile, American-led military alliances.
So, by trying to grab a small peninsula, he inadvertently created the militarized Cold War beast that would bleed the Soviet Union dry in an arms race for the next 40 years.
Exactly. It's the ultimate lesson in the law of unintended consequences. You pull a small thread in Korea, and the entire fabric of the world changes shape.
It really does put that forgotten war label to shame. It's not forgotten, it's foundational. We're still standing on top of the world it created.
We are. We lived in the house that the Korean War built for the rest of the 20th century.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought to mull over. This one from the historian Warren Cohen. He called Stalin's decision to support Kim Il-sung his most disastrous Cold War gamble. It just serves as a chilling reminder that in geopolitics, a small, seemingly low-risk miscalculation can echo for generations.
Absolutely. A powerful lesson.
Thank you for listening to this deep dive. Hopefully the fog has cleared a little bit on the Korean War and you can see just how pivotal it really was. We'll see you next time.